Hello, AEO Psychology class. Just a quick video for the second week looking at the history of scientific psychology. First, we'll look at something called the philosophy of empiricism. Think about this philosophical question. How do human beings form knowledge? Does it come from reflecting and thinking, or does it come from experiencing things? This has been batted around for millennia. Plato believed that it came from reflection and thinking. His student Aristotle, this is ancient Greece we're talking about, believed it came from experiencing. John Locke, another philosopher, this time from 1700s in England, also believed that we build knowledge by experiencing. So let's just take a little look at John Locke here. He was an English philosopher in the 17th century, meaning that he was actually active in the 1600s. He felt that thoughts and knowledge come from experience. This is a point of view that's known as empiricism. He argued that the mind begins as like a blank slate, something he called the tabula rasa. And then we have experiences, and these experiences write the contents of the mind. So just how do we experience things? Our mind receives what our sensory organs, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, seeing, our senses, our sensory organs, take things in from the outside world, and our mind receives that from those organs. Closer look at empiricism. Empiricism is when researchers, actually it's kind of like when psychology gained its independence from philosophy, and researchers started to examine and test human sensations and perception using scientific methods. It was also around this time that German universities would transform psychology into a modern empirical science by setting up labs that test predictions about behavior with systematic observations and data gathering. This led to a field called psychophysics. Psychophysics was the first scientific form of psychology, and it stated that the mind consisted of only what we sense. So the argument was that if we can understand the senses, then we can understand the mind. You're probably thinking, why physics? Why physics in psychophysics? A physicist might study the physical properties of light and sound, while psychophysicists study human perception of light and sound. For instance, estimate the weight of the following two items. Here we have a brick, and here we have a big pile of leaves. This is an important principle of psychophysics. The idea that the perception of physical properties is not the same as the physical properties themselves. People tend to think that a 1 pound brick probably weighs 2 or 3 times more than a pound of feathers or a pound of leaves. If someone said to you, what weighs more, a 1 pound brick or a pound of feathers, you'd think, well, that's, do you think I'm stupid? No. You know that they both equal 1 pound. But if you were to see these two items, a pile of bricks that is equal in weight to a pile of leaves or a pile of feathers, you would perceive the bricks as probably weighing much more than they actually weigh, and you'd think in your mind you would perceive them as being much heavier than the pile of leaves. All right, next we have a guy named Wilhelm Wundt. He's considered the father of modern psychology. He set up a psychology lab in Leipzig, Germany in 1879. He trained over 180 graduate students. I think it was like 186, and they're from different countries, and so they brought Wundt's ideas back to their home countries with them and set up university labs in their home countries. He is credited with giving psychology its independence from philosophy and physiology. And physiology is a branch of biology that deals with the normal functions of living organisms. Wundt was also what we call a structuralist. Structuralism. Guys like Wundt argued that if chemists can break down all matter into simple elements or structures, why couldn't psychologists do the same for the brain? And according to structuralism, breaking down experience into its elemental part is the best way to understand thought and behavior. They used something called introspection, looking into one's own mind for information about the nature of conscious experience. Trying to divide human experience into the smallest elements combined to make them. A structuralist describing a peach would not say that the peach is good. They would say something like, it's sweet, it's round, it's slightly orange, it's fuzzy, it's wet, it's juicy, etc. Structuralists might ask someone, how do you feel when you see a sunset, or when you smell coffee, or when you lick a kitten? The structuralist school of thought did not last long because it was way too subjective. It was based on personal feelings and tastes and opinions. And think of it, you may sense and feel something different than I do, even if we are licking the same kitten. That brings us to American philosopher and psychologist William James. William James is considered the founder of psychology in America. He's the first person to earn a PhD in psychology from his professor G. Stanley Hall at Harvard University. He opened up the first psychology lab at Johns Hopkins University. He started a scientific journal that's still around today called the American Journal of Psychology. He founded the American Psychological Association, or the APA. He's also the first president. James was a functionalist. Functionalism. It focuses on why we think and feel and smell and lick kittens. It's asking about the function of the behavior. It's partially based on Darwin's theory that adaptive behaviors, things that people and animals do in order to survive, how those things are conserved through the evolutionary process, how they're passed on from one generation to the next. This school of thought lent itself very well to behaviorism in the early 1900s, led by a guy named John Watson. Watson believed that psychology could only be a true science if it examined observable behaviors only. More about behaviorism later on in class. That brings us to Freud. Looks like I have my animations messed up on this, but he started his career at a hospital in Vienna, Austria, and he started his own practicing, specializing in nervous disorders in 1866. Freud witnessed his colleague Josef Brauer treat a patient named Anna O by using what was called a talking cure. He basically let her talk about her symptoms, and the more she talked about the symptoms, the more she brought up traumatic experiences, and the more she talked about traumatic experiences, the more her symptoms were reduced. From that point forward, Freud encouraged his patients to talk freely about whatever came to their mind. This was a technique called free association, and it was provided Freud a basis for his career, and also it launched an entire branch of psychology. Here we see Freud with his cigar. He felt that smoking helped him think. Of course, it also led to jaw cancer. When the Nazis came into power in the 1930s in Germany, Freud and his Jewish family escaped to England, and by that time, his cancerous jaw was so painful that his physician friend assisted in his suicide at age 84. So, public service announcement: lay off the smoking and the tobacco. I'm really messed up here. All right. Anyways, Freud published a book entitled The Interpretation of Dreams, and in it he introduced what he called psychoanalysis. He believed that our personalities were shaped by unconscious motives, right? In other words, he believed that we were all profoundly impacted by mental processes that we were not even aware of. But he did feel that the unconscious was discoverable. Even if you weren't aware of it, that's why they call it the unconscious. You could come to understand it through a therapeutic technique that used dreams, projections, and free association to root out repressed feelings and gain insight. And he was basically saying that mental disorders could be healed through talk therapy. And this was a really big breakthrough because prior to this, people with mental illnesses were confined to asylums. And at best, they would be given menial labor to do, and at worst, they would be like shackled to a bed frame or a wall. So Freud's ideas were very revolutionary and very important. A lot of people don't agree with Freud, and we'll get into Freud later on in class with the id, ego, and the superego. A lot of people think that his studies have a lot of merit. But we do know that this talk therapy or psychoanalysis is still around today and helping a lot of people. So in that sense, it was very, very revolutionary.